Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, Chilcot has published the report of the independent Iraq inquiry. This is a difficult day for all the families of those who lost loved ones. They've waited for this report for too long, and our first thoughts today must be with them. In their grief and anger, I hope they can draw at least some solace from the depth and rigour of this report, and above all, some comfort from knowing that we'll never forget the incredible service and sacrifice of their sons, daughters, husbands and wives, 179 British service men and women, and 23 British civilians who gave everything for our country. We must also never forget the thousands more who suffered life-changing injuries, and we must pledge today to look after them for the rest of their lives. Mr. Speaker, this report would have been produced sooner if it had begun when those of us on this side of the House and others first called for it back in 2006. But I'm sure the House will join me in thanking Sir John and his Privy Councillors, including the late Sir Martin Gilbert, who sadly passed away during the work on this report. Mr. Speaker, this has been a fully independent inquiry. Government ministers didn't even see it until yesterday morning. The Cabinet Secretary led a process that gave Sir John full access to government papers. This has meant an unprecedented public declassification of Joint Intelligence Committee papers, key Cabinet minutes, records of meetings and conversations between the UK Prime Minister and the American President, and 31 personal memos from the then Prime Minister Tony Blair to President George W. Bush. The inquiry also took evidence from more than 150 witnesses, and its report runs to 2.6 million words with 13 volumes, costing over £10 million to produce. Clearly the House will want the chance to study and debate it in depth, and I'm making provision for 2 full days of debate next week. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of key questions that are rightly asked about Iraq. Did we go to war on a false premise? Were decisions taken properly, including the consideration of legal advice? Was the operation properly planned? Were we properly prepared for the aftermath of the initial conflict? And did our forces have adequate funding and equipment? I will try and summarise the key findings on these questions before turning to the lessons that I believe should be learned. Mr. Speaker, a number of reasons were put forward for going to war in Iraq, including the danger that Saddam posed to his people and to the region, and the need to uphold United Nations resolutions. However, as everyone in this House will remember, central to the government's case was the issue of weapons of mass destruction. Sir John finds that there was an ingrained belief, genuinely held in both the UK and US government, that Saddam Hussein possessed chemical and biological capabilities, and that he wanted to redevelop his nuclear capabilities and was pursuing an active policy of deceit and concealment. Now, there were some good reasons for this belief. Saddam had built up chemical weapons in the past, and he had used them against Kurdish civilians and the Iranian military. He'd given international weapons inspectors the runaround for years, and the report clearly reflects that the advice given to the government by the intelligence and policy community was that Saddam did indeed continue to possess and seek to develop these capabilities. However, as we now know, by 2003, this long-held belief no longer reflected the reality. Sir John says that, and I quote, "At no stage was the proposition that Iraq might no longer have chemical, biological or nuclear weapons or programs identified and examined either by the JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee, or the policy community." And as the report notes, the late Robin Cook had shown it was possible to come to a different conclusion from an examination of the same intelligence. Mr. Speaker, in the wake of 9/11, the Americans were also understandably concerned about the risk of weapons of mass destruction finding their way into the hands of terrorists. Sir John finds that while it was reasonable to be concerned about the potential fusion of proliferation and terrorism, there was, and I quote, "no basis in the JIC assessments to suggest that Iraq itself represented such a threat." Mr. Speaker, on the question of intelligence, Sir John finds no evidence that intelligence was improperly included, or that Number 10, or Mr. Blair personally, improperly influenced the text of the September 2002 dossier. But he does find that the use of Joint Intelligence Committee material in public presentation did not make clear enough the limitations or the subtleties of assessments. He says that the assessed intelligence, and I quote, had not established beyond doubt either that Saddam Hussein had continued to produce chemical and biological weapons or that efforts to develop nuclear weapons continued. And as he says, the Joint Intelligence Committee, and I quote, should have made that clear to Mr. Blair. Sir John also finds that public statements from the government conveyed more certainty than the Joint Intelligence Committee assessments. And there was a lack of clarity about the distinction between what the JIC assessed and what Mr. Blair believed. Referring to the text in Mr. Blair's foreword to the September 2002 dossier, he finds, and I quote, a distinction between Mr. Blair's beliefs and the JIC's actual judgments. But in his words, Sir John does not question Mr. Blair's belief nor his legitimate role in advocating government policy. Now, turning to the question of legality, the inquiry has, and I quote, not expressed a view as to whether or not the UK's participation in the war was legal. However, it does quote the legal advice which the Attorney General gave at the time and on which the government acted, namely that there was a legal basis for action. Nevertheless, Sir John is highly critical of the processes by which the legal advice was arrived and discussed. And I quote, he says this, the circumstances in which it was ultimately decided that there was a legal basis for UK participation were far from satisfactory. And I'm sure honourable gentlemen and ladies will want to study that part of the report carefully. Sir John also finds that the diplomatic options had not at that stage been exhausted, and that, and I quote, military action was therefore not a last resort. Sir John says that when the second resolution at the UN became unachievable, the UK should have done more to exhaust all diplomatic options, including allowing the inspectors longer to complete their job. Turning to the decision-making, the report documents carefully the processes that were followed. There was a cabinet discussion before the decision to go to war, and a number of ministers, including the Foreign and Defence Secretaries, were involved in much of the decision-making. However, the report makes some specific criticisms of the process of decision-making. In particular, when it came to the options for military action, it is clear that these were never discussed properly by a cabinet committee or cabinet. Arrangements were often informal and sporadic, and frequently involved a small group of ministers and advisers, sometimes without formal records. And Sir John finds that at crucial points, Mr. Blair sent personal notes and made important commitments to Mr. Bush that had not been discussed or agreed with cabinet colleagues. However, while Sir John makes many criticisms of process, including the way information was handled and presented, at no stage does he explicitly say that there was a deliberate attempt to mislead people. Turning to operational planning, Mr. Speaker, the initial invasion proceeded relatively rapidly, and we should be proud of what our armed forces managed to achieve so quickly. This was despite the fact that the military didn't really have time to plan properly for an invasion from the south, because they had been focused on the north until a late decision from the Turkish government to refuse entry through their territory. It was also in spite of issues over equipment, which I will turn to later. But a bigger question was around the planning for what might happen after the initial operation. And we mentioned this briefly at Prime Minister's questions. Sir John finds that, and I quote, when the invasion began, the UK government was not in a position to conclude that satisfactory plans had been drawn up and preparations made to meet known post-conflict challenges and risks in Iraq. He adds that the government lacked clear ministerial oversight of post-conflict strategy, planning and preparation, and effective coordination between government departments, and failed to analyse or manage those risks adequately. The government, and here I mean officials in the military as well as ministers, remained too fixed on assumptions that the Americans had a plan, that the UN would play a significant role with international community sharing the burden, and that the UK role would be over 3 to 4 months after the conflict had ended. Sir John concludes that the government's failure to prepare properly for the aftermath of the conflict reduced the likelihood of achieving the UK's strategic objectives in Iraq. And Sir John concludes that anticipating these post-conflict problems, and I quote as I did at Prime Minister's questions, did not require the benefits of hindsight. Now, turning to equipment and troops, Sir John is clear that the UK failed to match resources to the objectives. Sir John says categorically that delays in providing adequate medium-weight protected patrol vehicles and the failure to meet the needs of UK forces for ISTAR and helicopters should not have been tolerated. And he says the MOD was slow in responding to the developing threat in Iraq from improvised explosive devices. The inquiry also identified a number of moments when it would have been possible to conduct a substantial reappraisal of our approach to the whole situation in Iraq and the level of resources required. But despite a series of warnings from commanders in the field, he finds that no such reappraisal took place. Furthermore, during the first 4 years, there was, and I quote, no clear statement of policy setting out the acceptable level of risk to UK forces and who was responsible for managing that risk. Sir John also finds that the government, and in particular the military, were too focused on withdrawing from Iraq and planning for an Afghan deployment in 2006, and that further drew effort away. Sir John concludes that although Tony Blair succeeded in persuading America to go back to the UN in 2002, he was unsuccessful in changing the US position on other critical decisions. And that, and I quote, in the absence of a majority in the Security Council in support of military action, at that point the UK was undermining the authority of the Security Council. And while it is right for a UK Prime Minister to weigh up carefully the damage to the special relationship that would be done by failing to support the US, Sir John says that it is questionable whether not participating militarily on this occasion would have broken the partnership. He says there was a substantial gap from the outset between the ambitious UK objectives and the resources that government was prepared to commit, and that even with more resources, the circumstances surrounding the invasion made it difficult to deliver substantive outcomes. While the territorial integrity of Iraq remained, deep sectarian divisions opened, and thousands of innocent Iraqi civilians lost their lives. And while these divisions were not created by the international coalition, Sir John believes they were exacerbated, including through the extent of de-Baathification, and they were not addressed by an effective programme of reconciliation. Overall, Sir John finds that the policy of Her Majesty's government fell far short of meeting its strategic objectives and helped to create a space for Al-Qaeda. Mr. Speaker, of course, the decision to go to war came to a vote in this House, and members on all sides who voted for military action will have to take our fair share of the responsibility. We cannot turn the clock back, but we can ensure that lessons are learnt and acted on. I'll turn to these in a moment and cover all the issues around machinery of government, proper processes, culture and planning, some of which we discussed in Prime Minister's questions. But let me be the first to say that getting all of these things right doesn't guarantee the success of a military intervention. For example, on Libya, I believe it was right to intervene to stop Gaddafi slaughtering his people. Now, in that case, we did have a United Nations Security Council resolution. We did have proper processes. We did have comprehensive advice on all the key issues, and we didn't put our forces on the ground. Instead, we worked with the transitional Libyan government. But getting these things right doesn't make the challenges of intervention any less formidable, and the difficulties in Libya are plain for everyone to see today. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister for the last 6 years, reading this report, I believe there are some lessons that we do need to learn and, frankly, keep on learning. First, taking the country to war should always be a last resort and should only be done if all credible alternatives have been exhausted. Second, the machinery of government does matter. That is why, on my first day in office, I established the National Security Council to ensure proper coordinated decision-making across the whole of government, including those responsible for our domestic security. This council isn't just a meeting of ministers, it has the right breadth of expertise in the room, with the Chief of the Defence Staff, the Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, the heads of the intelligence services and relevant senior officials. The Attorney General is now a member of the National Security Council. I also appointed the UK's first National Security Advisor with a properly constituted team in the Cabinet Office to ensure that all the key parts of our national security apparatus are properly joined up. The national security machinery also taps the experience and knowledge of experts from outside government. This helps us constantly challenge conventional wisdom within the system and avoid, hopefully, groupthink. Mr. Speaker, it is inconceivable today that we could take a premeditated decision to commit combat troops without a full and challenging discussion in the National Security Council on the basis of full papers, including written legal advice, prepared and stress-tested by all relevant departments, with decisions formally minuted. But third, I would argue also that the culture established by Prime Ministers matters too. It is crucial to good decision-making that a Prime Minister establishes a climate in which it's safe for officials and other experts to challenge existing policy and question the views of ministers and the Prime Minister without fear or favour. There's no question today that everyone sat around the NSC table is genuinely free to speak their mind. Fourth, if we are to take the difficult decisions to intervene in other countries, proper planning for what follows is vital. We know that the task of rebuilding effective governance is enormous. That is why we created the Conflict Stability and Stabilisation Fund and beefed up the Cross-Government Stabilisation Unit, so that experts are able to deploy in post-conflict situations anywhere in the world at short notice. And frankly, none of this would be possible without the historic decision we've taken to commit 0.7% of our gross national income on overseas aid. A lot of that money is spent on conflict-affected and fragile states, not only assisting with post-conflict planning, but also trying to prevent conflicts in the first place. Fifth, we must ensure our armed forces are always properly equipped and resourced. That is why we now conduct a regular strategic defence and security review to ensure the resources we have meet the ambitions of the national security strategy. We're meeting our NATO commitment to spend 2% of our GDP on defence and planning to invest at least £178 billion on new military equipment over the next decade. We've also enshrined the Armed Forces Covenant in law to ensure that our armed forces and their families receive the treatment and the respect they deserve. Mr. Speaker, sending our brave troops onto the battlefield without the right equipment was unacceptable, and whatever else we learn from this conflict, we must all pledge this will never happen again. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, there will be further lessons to learn from studying this report, and I commit today that that is exactly what we'll do. But, Mr. Speaker, in reflecting on this report and my own experience, there are also some lessons here that I do not think we should draw. First, it would be wrong to conclude that we shouldn't stand with our American allies when our common security interests are threatened. Yeah. We must never be afraid to speak frankly and honestly, as best friends always should, and where we commit our troops together, there must be a structure through which our views can be properly conveyed and differences worked through. But it remains the case that Britain and America share the same fundamental values, and Britain has no greater friend or ally in the world than America, and that our partnership remains as important for our security and prosperity today as it has ever been. Yeah. Second, I think it would be wrong to conclude that we cannot rely on the judgments of our brilliant and hard-working intelligence agencies. We know the debt we owe them in helping to keep us safe every day of the year. Since November 2014, they've enabled us to foil 7 different planned terrorist attacks on the streets of the United Kingdom. What this report shows is there needs to be a proper separation between the process of assessing intelligence and the policy making that flows from it. And as a result of the reform since the Butler report, that is what we now have in place. Third, it would be completely wrong to conclude that our military are not capable of intervening successfully around the world. Many of the failures in this report were not directly about the conduct of armed forces as they went into Iraq, but rather the failures of planning before a shot was fired. There's no question that Britain's armed forces remain the envy of the world, and the decisions we've taken to ensure they're properly resourced would ensure they stay that way. Finally, we should not conclude that intervention is always wrong. There are unquestionably times when it is right to intervene, as this country did successfully in Sierra Leone and Kosovo. And I'm sure that many in this House would agree that there have been times in the recent past when we should have intervened but didn't, like in failing to prevent the genocides in Rwanda or Srebrenica. Intervention is hard. War fighting is not always the most difficult part. Often the state building that follows is a much more complex challenge. We should not be naive to think that just because we have the best prepared plans in the real world, things can't go wrong. And equally, just because intervention is difficult, it doesn't mean that there are not times when it is right and necessary. Yes, Britain has and will continue to learn the lessons of this report. But as with our intervention against Daesh in Iraq and Syria today, Britain must not and will not shrink from its role on the world stage or fail to protect its people. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before addressing the issues raised in the Iraq inquiry report, I would like to remember and honour the 179 British servicemen and women who were killed, and the thousands maimed and injured during the Iraq War and their families, as well as the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who've died as a result of the invasion and occupation launched by the US and British governments 13 years ago. Yesterday, I had a private meeting with some of the families of the British dead, as I've continued to do over the past dozen years. It's always a humbling experience to witness the resolve and resilience of those families and their unwavering commitment to seek truth and justice for those that they lost in Iraq. They have waited 7 years for Sir John Chilcot's report. It was right that the inquiry heard evidence from such a wide range of people and that the origins, conduct and aftermath of the war should have been examined in such detail. But the extraordinary length of time it has taken to see the light of day is, frankly, clearly a matter for regret. I should add that the scale of the report, running to 6,275 pages, to which I was only given access at 8 o'clock this morning, means that today's response by all of us can only be a provisional one. Mr. Speaker, the decision to invade and occupy Iraq in March 2003 was the most significant foreign policy decision taken by a British government in modern times. It divided this House and set the government of the day against a majority of the British people, as well as against the weight of global opinion. The war was not in any way, as Sir John Chilcot says, a last resort. Frankly, it was an act of military aggression launched on a false pretext, as the inquiry accepts, and has long been regarded as illegal by the overwhelming weight of international legal opinion. It led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the displacement of millions of refugees. It devastated Iraq's infrastructure and society. The occupation fostered a lethal sectarianism, as the report indicates, that turned into a civil war. Instead of protecting security at home or abroad, the war fueled and spread terrorism across the region. To Sunday's suicide bomb attack in Baghdad, which killed over 250 people, the deadliest so far, was carried out by a group whose origins lie in the aftermath of the invasion. By any measure, the invasion and occupation of Iraq has been, for many, a catastrophe. Mr. Speaker, the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 on the basis of what the Chilcot report calls, and I quote, flawed intelligence about the weapons of mass destruction has had a far-reaching impact on us all. It's led to a fundamental breakdown in trust in politics and in our institutions of government. The tragedy is that while the governing class got it so horrifically wrong, many of our people actually got it right. Many, on February the 15th, 2003, 1.5 million, spanning the entire political spectrum, and tens and millions of other people across the world, marched against the impending war, the biggest ever demonstration in British history. It wasn't, Mr. Speaker, that those of us who opposed the war, underestimated the brutality or the crimes of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. Indeed, many of us campaigned against the Iraqi regime during its most bloody period, when the British government and the US administration were actually supporting that regime, as was confirmed by the 1996 Scott inquiry. But we could see this state, broken by sanctions and war, posed no military threat, and the WMD evidence was flimsy and confected, that going to war without United Nations authorization was profoundly dangerous, that foreign invasion and occupation would be resisted by force, and they would set off a series of uncontrollable and destructive events. If only this House had been able to listen to the wisdom of many of our own people when it voted on the 18th of March against waiting for a UN authorization for a second resolution, the course of events might have been different. All but 16 of the members of the official opposition at that time supported the war, whilst many in my party voted against it, as did others in other opposition parties. There are members here today on all benches, including dozens of my Labour colleagues, who voted against the war. But none of us, Mr. Speaker, should take any satisfaction from this report. Instead, all of us, I believe...
We can't have a running commentary on the statements made from the front bench. Members of this House know me well enough to know that I will allow all opinions to be expressed, and if that means the Prime Minister has to be here for quite a long time, he's accustomed to that. But the right honourable gentleman is entitled to be heard with courtesy. If people want to witter away, leave the chamber. It's boring and we don't need you. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have to be saddened at what has been revealed, and we must now reflect on that. In addition to all those British service people and Iraqi civilians and combatants who lost their lives in the conflict, there are many members here who voted to stop the war, but have not lived to see themselves vindicated by this report. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, it would do us well to remember Robin Cook, who stood over there 13 years ago and said, in a few hundred words, in advance of the tragedy to come, what has been confirmed by this report in more than 2 million words. The Chilcot report has rightly dug deep into the litany of failures of planning for the occupation, the calamitous decision to stand down the Iraqi army and to dissolve the entire Iraqi state as a process of de-Baathification. But the reality is, it was the original decision to follow the US President into this war, in the most volatile region in the world, and impose a colonial-style occupation that led to every other disaster. The government's September 2002 dossier, with its claim declaring that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed in 45 minutes, was only the most notorious of many deceptions. As Major General Michael Lorry told the inquiry, and I quote, "We knew at the time that the purpose of the dossier was precisely to make the case for war rather than setting out the available intelligence." Military action in Iraq not only turned a humanitarian crisis into a disaster, it also convulsed the entire region, just as intervention in Libya in 2011 has sadly left the country in the grip of warring militias and terror groups. And the Iraq War actually increased the threat of terrorism in our own country, as Baroness Manningham-Buller, former head of MI5, made clear to the inquiry. There are many lessons that need to be drawn from the Iraq War and the investigation carried out by Sir John Chilcot and his inquiry for our government, our country, this Parliament, as well as my party and indeed every other party. They include the need for a more open and independent relationship with the United States and for a foreign policy based on upholding international law and the authority of the United Nations, which always seeks peaceful solutions to international disputes. We also need, and the Prime Minister indicated this, much stronger oversight of the security and intelligence services, full restoration of proper cabinet government, and give Parliament the decisive say over any future decisions to go to war, based on objective information, not just through government discretion, but through a War Powers Act that I hope this Parliament will pass. And as in the increasingly resort to hybrid warfare based on the use of drones and special forces, our democracy, and our democracy is crucial and important, needs to ensure that their use is subject to proper parliamentary scrutiny. There are no more important decisions a Member of Parliament ever gets asked to make than those relating to peace and war. The very least that Members of Parliament and the country should be able to expect is rigorous and objective evidence on which to base their crucial decisions. We now know that the House was misled in the run-up to the war, and the House must now decide how it should deal with it 13 years later, just as all those who took the decisions laid bare in the Chilcot report must face up to the consequences of their actions, whatever they may be. Later today, I'll be meeting a group of families of military servicemen and women who lost loved ones, Iraq War veterans and Iraqi citizens who have lost family members as a result of the war that the US and British governments launched in 2003. I'll be discussing with them, our public and the Iraqi people, the decisions taken by our then government that led the country into war with the terrible consequences. Quite bluntly, Mr. Speaker, there are huge lessons for every single one of us here today. We make decisions that have consequences that don't just go on for the immediate years, they go on for decades and decades afterwards. We need to reflect very seriously before we take any decisions, again, to take military action without realising the consequences of those will live with all of us for many decades to come and have often incalculable consequences as a result.
Prime Minister.
Well, let me briefly respond to that, because I want to leave as much time for colleagues to make their points. I think the right honourable gentleman is right to praise the families for the dignity they've shown. I understand the regret over the time taken, and I think we all feel that. The only point I'd make is when you have an independent report, you have to allow it to be independent, and you have to allow the chairman to make his own or her own decisions in their own way. And so while it's been frustrating, I think that frustration has probably been better than intervention. In terms of the time he was given to read the report, I didn't want politicians, including the former Prime Minister, to be given more time than the families themselves, and that's why the 8 o'clock deadline was set. On the report itself, look, I think he's right to say that the report finds that the intervention did create space for Al-Qaeda. The only point I'd make is it is important to remember that violent Islamist extremism, Al-Qaeda and all of that, started long before the Iraq War, started with, in fact, long before 9/11 itself, which of course was several years before the Iraq invasion. I think it's important for us to remember that. In terms of the litany of failures, I'd urge him to read, I've been able to read the executive summary and some other bits and pieces, and I'm sure colleagues will. He's right, there are a litany of failures: the disbanding of the army, the de-Baathification, the way the Kurdish and Provisional Authority worked, the failure to plan for the aftermath, and I think the very, very powerful points made by Sir John Chilcot. In terms of the lessons to learn, I thought many of the points he made I think we have already put in place proper cabinet discussions, National Security Council discussions, parliamentary votes, the oversight of the intelligence agencies. I would urge him, before coming up with even more ways to oversee our intelligence agencies, I would really urge colleagues from right around the House to look at the way the beefed up Intelligence and Security Committee works and the other things that we've done, not least in the legislation going through both houses. We do need to leave, I think, our intelligence services with a clear set of instructions and oversight arrangements rather than change them every 5 minutes. War Powers Act. I think this is something that will be discussed in the two-day debate. It's something I have looked at very carefully, and I've come to the conclusion this is not the right thing to do. I think we'll get ourselves into a legal mess, but I think the House should clearly debate it, as it will when it considers this report. And on the issue of the United States, he calls for an open and something partnership. Look, I don't believe the United States is always right about everything, but I do believe our partnership with the United States is vital for our national security, and I rather fear his approaches that the United States is always wrong. I don't think they're always right, but I think they're always our best partner, and we should work with them. But I'd urge him and others to take the time to read the report in its not in its entirety. I don't think any of us will have time for 3.8 million words, but it's very carefully judged and very carefully thought through. And I think you should read it in conjunction with the statement that Sir John has given today, which is a very articulate distillation of what he says in his 200-page summary, and I think that's what we should be guided by.
Yeah. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, we'll all need time to study the many damning conclusions in this report about how this catastrophic decision was reached in 2003. But the Prime Minister does say we should read it with an eye to future lessons for the machinery of government. Does my right honourable friend agree that, whilst I know from my own experience that the introduction of the National Security Council was a very valuable innovation, that his successor should be recommended to look at whether or not we should not return to the pre-Blair era of full collective cabinet responsibility with proper time for meetings, proper information and studied conclusions, and whether we should not also look at whether parliamentary accountability for these things should be reconsidered so that there are full and properly informed debates here, held in good time before, in this case, the military are deployed and everything is set in hand and the position is irreversible. We really do need to go back to a much more collective and accountable form of government.
Well, my runner friend makes good points. Let me respond. In terms of cabinet responsibility, yes, before a decision like this is made, you need to have a cabinet meeting and cabinet discussion. But I would not try and substitute that for what the work the NSC now does, because, frankly, having sitting in front of you around the table the head of MI5, the head of MI6, the head of the chief of the defence staff, they are sitting there as equal members, able to speak up and tell you what they think. That debate, I think, is frankly more valuable than simply listening to other secretaries of state, although they are also there as well. So I still think that is the best place to do that. In terms of parliamentary debates, yes, we should have them, and it is good if you have them in reasonable time. I think one of the issues with the Iraq debate is it was so close to the point of decision that I think many colleagues felt that to vote in a different way was somehow to let down our troops on the eve of a vitally important decision. So early debate is always good.
Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin by thanking the Prime Minister for advance sight of the statement and a few short hours this morning to have a look at the millions of words in the report. Today we remember the hundreds of thousands of people who have died in Iraq, Iraqi civilians, and of course the 179 UK service personnel who have lost their lives. Today is an important, it's a sombre day for their families, and our hearts go out to them. The report that we are considering now will be pored over in the days, the weeks, the months ahead, and it should be the first step in learning the lessons from the UK's most shameful foreign policy action in decades. At paragraph 416 of the executive summary, the Chilcot report confirms that on the 28th of July 2002, Tony Blair wrote to President Bush saying, and I quote, "I will be with you, whatever." Frankly, Mr. Speaker, it is remarkable that the Prime Minister didn't think that that was even noteworthy to mention in his statement to the House. And my first question to the Prime Minister is why? Given much of the debate rests about the rationale of the Prime Minister of the time signing up to whatever course of action the United States was prepared to pursue. On intelligence, the report concludes, paragraph 807, that the assessed intelligence had not established beyond doubt either that Saddam Hussein had continued to produce chemical and biological weapons or that efforts to develop nuclear weapons continued. I completely understand, Mr. Speaker, why the families of dead and injured UK service personnel and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis will feel that they were deceived about the reasons for going to war in Iraq. I completely understand why they also feel let down when it came to the post-conflict situation. And the Chilcot report catalogues in graphic detail the failures in planning for post-conflict Iraq. At paragraph 630 of the executive summary, when Mr Blair set out the UK's vision for the future of Iraq in the House of Commons on the 18th of March 2003, no assessment had been made of whether that vision was achievable, no agreement had been reached with the United States on a workable post-conflict plan, UN authorisation had not yet been secured, and there had been no decision on the UN role in post-conflict Iraq. Goes on at paragraph 814 to say, Mr Blair, who recognised the significance of the post-conflict phase, did not press President Bush for definite assurances about US plans. He did not consider or seek advice on whether the absence of a satisfactory plan called for reassessment of the terms of the UK's engagement, and did not make agreement on such a plan a condition of UK participation in military action. In fact, Mr Speaker, the Chilcot report concludes that, I quote from paragraph 857, the UK did not achieve its objectives. The lack of planning has also been evident since in relation to Afghanistan, to Libya, to Syria, and most recently, with absolutely no plan whatsoever in regards to Brexit. So when will UK governments of either Tory or Labour hue actually start learning from the mistakes of the past so we are not condemned to repeat them. I hope and I expect that in the months ahead there will be the opportunity to hold to account those who are associated and responsible with taking the UK to war in Iraq that has only caused hundreds and thousands of deaths. Not just that, it has undermined people's faith in Parliament and government in the UK and left an indelible stain on Britain's standing in the world.
Let me thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks. He rightly says it is a sombre day, and he's absolutely correct to do that. He highlighted in his intervention a number of the very serious mistakes that were made, not least on planning for the aftermath. He asked me a specific question about why I didn't mention the specific Tony Blair note to President Bush. What I said, I was trying to be very careful in my statement to accurately summarise what Sir John Chilcot has said, and I did have a whole section in my statement saying about the processes, and I said Sir John finds that at crucial points Mr Blair sent personal notes and made important commitments to Mr Bush that had not been discussed or agreed with Cabinet colleagues. And I think it's worth reading Sir John Chilcot's statement this morning about that. He rightly focuses on paragraph 630, which is a powerful paragraph that says when Mr Blair set out the UK's vision of the future of Iraq, no assessment had been made about whether that vision was achievable, no agreement had been reached with the US on a workable post-conflict plan, UN authorisation had not been secured, etc. So, I mean, that is, I think, one of the most powerful passages in the report, and he's right to draw attention to it. I don't accept that all the same failures are apparent in some way when it comes to planning in Afghanistan. I don't accept that. Afghanistan, there was a very clear connection between a Taliban regime that was playing host to al-Qaeda and the goal of government policy, which I supported at the time and indeed put into place when I became Prime Minister, was to make sure that country couldn't become a safe haven for al-Qaeda. And there was some considerable success in pursuing that. And there was a huge amount of planning into the post-conflict situation in Afghanistan. Indeed, we're still engaged in that. To say there hasn't been a plan, there is a plan. There's a UK-run officer training academy to strengthen their army. But as I said in my earlier statement, you know, you can have all the plans in the world, but these are still extremely difficult things to get right. If he's somehow saying there's no point in ever taking part in any of these interventions or trying to help any of these countries, well, that's a different position, and he should be honest and say that. But I would argue with Afghanistan, with Libya, indeed with Brexit, we have set out what the alternatives are, but it doesn't mean they're easy.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
The Foreign Affairs Committee has stayed its inquiry into our intervention in Libya in order to take into account the conclusions of the Iraq inquiry. Given that the inquiry's central conclusions could be claimed to apply to some degree or other to Libya, not least stabilisation planning being described by my right honourable friend for Rutland at the time as fanciful rot, and to us in evidence as an unrealistic desktop exercise, would he reconsider his understandable decision not to give us oral evidence during the referendum campaign so that the reaching of the analysis of machinery of government changes he outlined earlier to the right honourable member for Angus can be properly assessed by the committee?
I think the Foreign Secretary, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his remarks. I think the Foreign Secretary will be giving evidence. Obviously, the Prime Minister is always asked to give evidence to every select committee of the House. I try to stick to answering questions here and the liaison committee rather than, and also the National Security Committee, because that brings together a number of different committees. So I don't think it will be possible, but I'll always consider any request.
Mrs. Margaret Beckett.
Can I first wholeheartedly endorse the remarks the Prime Minister made about those who lost their lives? Could I also ask him, does he agree that each of us, in Cabinet or in this House, who are responsible and should take responsibility for our own individual decisions, albeit taken in good faith on the basis of evidence before us? But equally, does he agree that the men of hatred and death in Al-Qaeda and Daesh ISIL should take responsibility for their actions and for the blood and horror that they inflict on others?
I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. I mean, I speak as someone who has relatively new backbencher sitting up there, was listening to the arguments and coming to my own conclusions. And I think anyone who voted for the conflict has to take their share of responsibility. I don't choose to go back and say, well, if I knew now what I know then and all the rest of it. I just think you make a decision, you defend it at the time, and then you have to live with the consequences and bear your share of responsibility. And that's certainly the position I take. I think she does make a very good point, though, about the evil of these violent Islam extremists, whether in Al-Qaeda or Daesh or elsewhere. This problem in our world existed before the Iraq War. It exists and is worse today. We're doing all sorts of things in all sorts of ways to try and combat it. And while this debate about what happened in Iraq and the decisions that were taken is vital, we must not let it sap our energy for dealing with this cancer in our world, which is killing us in our own country.
Mr. David Davis.
There we are. We've just been listening to the Prime Minister. As you can see, they're making an urgent statement on the findings of the Chilcot inquiry, the long-awaited Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War and its aftermath. And Mr. Cameron, in effect, saying amongst many things he said there, that he feels that many of the changes that should flow from the failings that Sir John identified, particularly when it came to intelligence gathering and its interpretation and decision-making at cabinet level or not at cabinet level, he feels that the changes have been made and systems are very different from now. We were awaiting the statement from the Leader of the Opposition, though, of course, his response, Jeremy Corbyn, and in particular, given his long campaign against involvement in the Iraq War, some of his supporters there making it very clear there they want to see Tony Blair. They want to see follow-up in terms of what happens to Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, who took the decision to take Britain into Iraq. The protesters, I don't know if you can hear them there, saying that he is a war criminal. Well, we wanted to hear what Mr. Corbyn's view was on Tony Blair. Well, as far as I heard, he didn't actually name Mr. Blair, but was very clear when he said many times that decisions taken at that time have consequences for many, many years to come, and those that made those decisions bear a very heavy responsibility. Well, let's bring in our political editor, Faisal Islam, who's been listening to all that. And so what did we glean, first of all, Faisal, about the response from Jeremy Corbyn?
It was a measured response from the Leader of the Opposition. He's waited many years to make a response like that. He avoided saying explicitly, I told you so. He said it wasn't the time for vindication, given so many deaths of British people and deaths of Iraqis too. But he did say that the arguments made by the likes of Robin Cook, a very powerful moment, that Robin Cook had made the same argument as Sir John Chilcot 10, 15 years ago, and he'd made it in the same spot that Jeremy, just across the spot where from Jeremy Corbyn was making that argument. But you're absolutely right. Notable, no mention of Mr. Blair. Notable, no mention of criminal courts. And also no mention of an apology that had been promised in Jeremy Corbyn's leadership challenge. And we had expected as soon as the Labour conference last year. We were told we had to wait until the Chilcot report. It might be that he chooses to make that apology or any further moves outside of Parliament later today. We're just waiting to see where that goes. But in Parliament, he didn't say anything. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister also saying that it was important for the Commons to learn the lessons of this, learn the lessons about the culture of government where people don't speak truth to power, learn the lessons about intelligence, learn the lessons about planning too. But he also said, don't learn the wrong lessons, that intervention is sometimes necessary, that there are examples where we haven't intervened as a nation militarily, where we might have, and it would have been better for the world. And he mentioned Srebrenica in Bosnia as an example of that. But also, there was some forensic going over some of the Chilcot report. Angus Robertson, the SNP leader in particular, went for a memo that I just want you to have a look at, the what's become known as the I'll be there whatever memo. I think we can bring that up there. I will be with you whatever. This is a note from Tony Blair to George Bush from July 2002, 8 months before the war, and that could well be the, if you like, the symbolic totemic memo that comes out. I'll be with you, whatever. He then qualifies that and saying he needs a series of diplomatic and planning help. This is not Afghanistan, it's not even the Gulf War, he says. He's trying to say to George Bush, this is going to be much more difficult than you want. But elsewhere in that memo, which I don't think we've got all of it, it's very interesting. He says things like, we don't want to swap one dictator for another one. That's inconsistent with our values. But he also suggests that the US did not want any evidence. They were happy to go to war. So he suggests that we still need to make the case. If we recapitulate all the WMD evidence, add his attempts, Saddam's attempts to secure nuclear capability, and, as seems possible, add an al-Qaeda link, it will be hugely persuasive over here. Those people like Jeremy Corbyn and Angus Robertson, who have been against the war, will see that as Tony Blair beginning to make a case that did not subsequently stand up. He also, we've also got other things from that memo that are rather interesting. He sets a potential strike date of January or February in that memo from July 2. That wasn't exactly what he was saying publicly. You wouldn't perhaps say the Prime Minister wouldn't say wholly publicly what he was saying to the President of the US. And I'm sure Mr. Blair's people will argue that this was part of his diplomatic strategy to get as close to George Bush as possible, to flatter him and try and change the trajectory of what would have been a unilateral engagement from the US. That will be his argument. The people against the war, whilst not a smoking gun, will see some evidence in that memo for Mr. Blair saying things privately to George Bush and giving him assurances that weren't being communicated publicly, and perhaps see it as evidence that he'd made up his mind months before war actually started.
All right, Faisal, thank you very much indeed. Faisal Islam there, our political editor. And it should be said that we are expecting Mr. Blair, Tony Blair, who looms large in discussions about so many aspects of this report at 1:30 round about then. We've already had a statement from Tony Blair released by his office almost immediately after the publication of the report. And Mr. Blair saying the report should lay to rest allegations of bad faith, lies or deceit. Whether people agree or disagree with my decision to take military action against Saddam Hussein, I took it in good faith and in what I believe to be the best interests of the country. And he says he will respond, though, to the real and material criticisms of preparation planning process and of relations with the United States. That's a key point that Faisal was making. I will respond to them later in the afternoon. We're expecting that in just a few minutes' time. Of course, we'll bring that to you live. But in the meantime, let's just rewind, because it's only a couple of hours and a bit since the report was formally released, and it was released in a news conference, a statement made by Sir John Chilcot himself, and this is just some of what he had to say.
But the questions for the inquiry were whether it was right and necessary to invade Iraq in March 2003, and whether the UK could and should have been better prepared for what followed. We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. We have also concluded that the judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate. The government failed to achieve its stated objectives. The inquiry has not expressed a view on whether military action was legal. That could, of course, only be resolved by a properly constituted and internationally recognized court. We have, however, concluded that the circumstances in which it was decided that there was a legal basis for UK military action were far from satisfactory. Mr. Blair told the inquiry that the difficulties encountered in Iraq after the invasion could not have been known in advance. We do not agree that hindsight is required. the risks of internal strife in Iraq, active Iranian pursuit of its interests, regional instability, and al-Qaeda activity in Iraq were each explicitly identified before the invasion. From 2006, the UK military was conducting two enduring campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. It did not have sufficient resources to do so. The UK military role in Iraq ended a very long way from success.
Well, just some of the findings of Sir John introduced there by himself, but of course it is 2.6 million words long. I want to get to reactions now from two men who know about Iraq and Britain's involvement in it up close and personal, so to speak. Major General Jonathan Shaw, a former commander of British forces in Iraq in Basra in 2007, and Sir William Patey, a former ambassador to Iraq 2005 and 6, if I'm right, Sir William. And gentlemen, from you both, overall, there is so much to absorb, but from your perspective, your involvement in Iraq, has Sir John got it just about right?
Yes, I think he has. I've hadn't had a chance to read the whole report, but his main findings are hard to disagree with.
Well, this is from your perspective, the post-conflict planning and then implementation of whatever plan there was.
Well, there wasn't much planning. That's the problem, and I think there were a number of crucial mistakes that were made at the beginning of the campaign that then compounded the absence of planning. So we had too few troops. We didn't have enough to maintain law and order. Some of the structure of the Iraqi state just wasn't there. It was having to be built from scratch within an atmosphere of sectarianism that was unleashed by the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, some of which would have been predictable.
Were you, though, frustrated? I mean, were you sitting there, the Americans in overall charge, and they took the big decisions. Were you frustrated? Were there warnings coming from the British side?
Well, I was there in 2005-06 after Jeremy Greenstock had warned Bremer that it was a mistake to take the level of de-Baathification down and disband the army, so we were living with that. The reality was the Americans were calling the shots. We were allies, we had some influence, but there was a limit to your influence. I remember being told that the most important thing for you was to stay close to the Americans. So if you became a thorn in their side, then it meant you could be excluded from the inner circle, which is something you didn't want to happen.
Well, from the military side, Major General, was that the same kind of aspect?
I think it's an interesting question to the extent to which the British conducted an independent operation as opposed to one linked with the Americans. There seemed very quickly to be very much a view that the South was very much a British domain. Americans keep off, we'll do our campaign. And in the early part of the year, we were rather self-gloriously described ourselves as the exemplar division, because theoretically, on the surface, things seemed to be going better in Basra than they were up in Baghdad. That claim, of course, came back to haunt us when things didn't seem to be going so well later on, and hence quite a lot of the anger at America for Britain being seen to pull out at the end. But in the end, the report today describes what the deal I did in 2007 as a sort of a humiliation, but it says quite rightly that it was the best option around, and I would still justify my judgment.
Let's just look at that in some detail, and you can tell us, as the man who cut that deal, these were with forces that had been attacking and indeed killing British forces, but you felt it was the least worst option.
Well, absolutely. If you look back at just about any counterinsurgency campaign we've engaged in, we seem to end up cutting a deal, because in the end these are political activities. These aren't straight wars. Well, as far as I was concerned, the military war ended when we toppled Saddam. From then on, it was a political piece of reconstruction. The goal was always to put the Iraqis in charge. The people who were attacking us were part of Malika's constituency. It was very difficult. So we had to do a deal
within
with
that
them in some
context,
way.
did you